Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to a pre-release analysis on Cyno. As always, this is a pre-release. All of this information is both subject to change and not tested by myself, which means that it's very possible that once I test it, I realize that there's some things that I'm expecting that aren't actually gonna be as good as I expect them to be, or that are gonna be better than I expect them to be. So just keep that in mind. If you're using information on this video to decide whether or not to wish, tune in on my stream day one of the release, or on my post-release video that I'll get out before the banner is gone. Make sure to not only base your decision whether or not to pull on pre-release information if you're pulling for meta reasons. Always wait until the unit's been out for a few days. But yeah, let's take a look at his artifact sets now. I'm sure you guys have seen it, right? Some of these are with Thunder Soother, some of these are with Thundering Fury, and you might have also seen that the Thunder Soother one, right, 159 for Deathmatch, 167 for Thundering Fury. Most of the weapons, I haven't actually looked at all of them, all of the sets you can go for, but with Deathmatch specifically, I've looked at the four main ones, which are going to be Thundering Fury, Thunder Soother, Gladiators, and Gilded Dreams. And unfortunately, we have Thundering Fury ahead of the others. We'll get into why soon. Then we have 4 Thunder Soother with perfect uptime. You're probably not going to have perfect uptime, but you get relatively close because his electro application is very fast. Then you have 4 Gladiator. Generally, it's actually going to be about as good as 4 Thunder Soother because of the non 100% uptime on Thunder Soother. And then you have Gilded Dreams. Now, part of the reason why Gilded Dreams is so far behind in this case is because I'm assuming that you're going to be playing him with Dendro main character, and he gains 100 EM from his burst, and you kind of want to go EM Sands over attack Sands. And that means that you already have 407 EM in this case. So the 180 Elemental Mastery you gain from Gilded Dreams, assuming you have a second Electro character, which you generally will, doesn't actually give you like a massive significant amount. It's good, but there's generally going to be better options. So let's actually explain why Thundering Fury actually performs so well. The main reason is because of his Ascension 1. So his Ascension 1 makes your next E deal more damage every 4-ish seconds. What that means is if you're going for a traditional set and you go for a 3-second E cooldown, you can't use your E every 3 seconds. You have to wait 4 seconds. Otherwise, you're going to miss your Ascension 1. So your E cooldown is actually longer than what it says here. Whereas if you go with Thundering Fury, you can actually pretty reliably get a 2-second cooldown E, in which case you can use 2 in between each Ascension 1 proc. And so with Thundering Fury, you basically end up getting twice the amount of E's. Now the actual amount you get isn't exactly twice, because like I said, the first E is delayed a little bit, but the first like N-Seer is delayed a little bit. So what you'll generally do as your combos is you have TF and you'll have others. The general set you're going to do E, Q, N3, E, N5, and then you have E with Ascension 1. And then you're basically going to be able to do more or less N5, N2, E, Ascension 1, and you can just repeat that. Now, generally, from what I've looked at, it seems to be optimal to stay on the field for around 18 seconds, which is going to be 3 Ascension 1 procs. Right, so you stay on his burst for around 15, because you do EQ, whatever, right? You get 3 Ascension 1 procs, and then you swap out. You can go for another one. It's going to increase his damage, but it's going to slow down your rotations. I generally wouldn't recommend it. Now, with Thundering Fury, what you get is you do E, Q, but then you can actually get another E because your E's 2-second cooldown, and it kind of just lines up. You can also do N1E instead, but the basic combo is basically going to be this, right? E, Q, E, and then you can do N4, but here's the thing. His 4-hit combo is actually a double hit. So what you want to do is you want to cancel it before the second hit, because what you'll be able to do is you'll be able to get N1, N2, N3, then you'll get your 4th hit, and that hit is going to be applying Electro. And that can prog the Thundering Fury set, which means that you'll be able to do N4-1, right, the first part of your N4, and then mash your E button and get your E because of the Thundering Fury prog. And you'll just repeat that over and over. The reason why this ends up working out incredibly well is because from his first normal attacks hit to his 4th normal attack hit, there's about 2 seconds. Which means that if your first attack applies Electro, your 4th attack will apply Electro as well, because of the hit rule. But if you then use your E and then go back to your first normal attack, because of internal cooldown, what's going to end up happening is you'll have met the 2.5 second time rule, and so your N1 is going to apply Electro again. So what will end up happening is effectively, for most of your combos, you're actually going to get 2 Electro applications. Generally, it'll be 2, sometimes it'll be slightly less. Now, the thing about his Ascension 1 is it's not exactly 4 seconds, and as far as I understand, it is actually increased by hit lag. Talking about the exact exact intervals is actually just gonna make it more complicated, but you're more or less able to get this, which is 4 hits of normal attack in between each E. Sometimes it'll be 3, sometimes it'll be 5, but as a general rule, it's gonna be around 4. And because of the way that internal cooldown works, this is actually pretty beneficial for you. So, with the TF set, you end up getting 1 E outside of burst, 4 E's that do not have the Ascension 1 inside of burst, and 1, 2, 3 E's that do have the Ascension 1 inside of burst. On other sets, you get 1 E outside of burst, 1 E that doesn't have A1, and then 3 E's that do. So basically, you're getting 3 more E's on the Thundering Fury set, which is more energy, but also more damage. Now, you do end up getting slightly more motion values from your normal attacks total on the non-TF set. You look at the motion values, you actually do end up getting more on your normal attacks when you go non-TF. But you get a lot less from your E, because you get less E's. And that actually means that in total, you kind of actually do get more motion value on the TF thing. But then on top of that, because your E has a separate ICD, you get more aggravates on your E. And then on top of that, because it lines up so well with your 4 normal attack combo, you can actually get more aggravates as well. So basically, what ends up happening is you're sacrificing a little bit of motion value of talent damage on your normal attacks. And in exchange, you get more aggravates on your normal attacks, more aggravates on your E, more motion value on your E, and motion value total. It's just more. And then on top of that, you get more energy generation. All of this to say, as a general rule, the Thundering Fury set is actually going to be the best set on Cyno. However, and this is a big caveat, in order for it to be good, you need to be doing this. If the enemies end up moving away, or you end up attacking the wrong enemy, it can actually fuck up your Thundering Fury procs. And if you miss a Thundering Fury proc, if the enemy dodges one of your attacks, then it's gonna delay your E by 1 second. And that's actually gonna mean that you don't get your Ascension 1 on your E, which is a massive loss in damage. So while the Thundering Fury set is generally going to be his best set, it is important to understand that it does have a downside. If you can't do the right combo because you got staggered because the enemies moved, it actually becomes worse than the other options because it is reliant on getting all of your TF procs. Whereas on the other combos, if you miss an aggravate on your normal attacks, you still get your ends here. So it's not as big of a deal. But yeah, all of this to say, yes, TF is generally going to be his best set, but it's not the only set you can go for. And if you don't want to bother with having to do the right combo always, you can very well go for a different set. It's not a waste to farm for other sets, basically. So, 4-piece Thundering Fury, best in slot. But 4-piece Thunder Soother, good alternative. 4-piece Glad, good alternative. And 4-piece Gilded, good alternative. Generally, Glad and Thunder Soother will be slightly better than Gilded Dreams, but in the case of his signature weapon, it converts Elemental Mastery to attack, so more Elemental Mastery means you get more value out of the passive, which means that on his signature weapon specifically, Gilded Dreams is actually going to be better than Thunder Soother. And it's not that far behind Thundering Fury, so you might actually just want to go for Gilded Dreams in general. So, what stats are you looking for? Well, Sans, EM, but attack is fine. Goblet, basically always going to be damage percent, and Circlet is basically always going to be crit. However, just like Dragon's Bane can be situational for Hyperbloom, Elemental Mastery Circlet can be situational, or even Goblet can be situational for Hyperblooms. Also, because of the way that his kit ends up working out, because he has some motion value that's based on his Elemental Mastery, and if we take a look at Deathmatch with the exact same things, but an Elemental Mastery Circlet instead of crit, it is going to be worse, right? It's worse by about 10%, but if you're doing Hyperbloom stuff, it can still be better. And if you go for his signature weapon, right? If we look at EM Circlet on this, the difference is actually a lot less, right? It's only 6-ish% instead. Point being, generally, you will want to be going for crit, but it is technically possible that EM can still be good if you have a really, really good substats. I'm not gonna write it down, but it's still worth mentioning. And now finally, when it comes to his teams. And in order to talk about his teams, we unfortunately have to talk about how strong he's gonna be. It brings me so much pain to say this, but Cyno's not going to be that strong. And because he's not going to be that strong, then some of his viable teams are going to be teams where you have no reason to play Cyno over other units, but they're just teams that are really good baseline. You can play Cyno in National, you can play Cyno in Taser. And it's not because he's particularly good there, it's just because the cores of those teams are really strong, and Cyno's like synergistic teams aren't actually that insane, and so the difference in performance between the two won't actually be very big. I'm not saying that he's going to be bad, and I think that's important to understand. Cyno won't be bad. It's just that we have so many teams that are incredibly good, and compared to those teams, he will be somewhat underwhelming. He does have things going his way in exchange for that though. He's basically a hyper carry. He's meant to have very long field time, which is a downside when you look at actual DPS, when you look at rotations, when you look at all that stuff. But for more casual players that don't really bother learning rotations, that don't really want to be playing national all the time, and that just want to play a character they like, they'll very often end up spending a lot of time on a unit, whether that's optimal or not. And because of that, when you have a unit that's a hyper carry, where there's actually a reason to spend a lot of time on them, then for casual players, that unit will overperform compared to how strong they are in teams that are played optimally. And as much as like you can just say, wow, skill issue, haha, casual players are a very significant portion of the player base, and they want to know if a unit's good or not. Just because you're gonna play a unit no matter what doesn't mean that you just don't want to know if they're good. Just because what attracts you to a unit is their personality doesn't mean you don't give a shit about how strong they are. And the reality is, very, very often, I think that meta-focused people just, it's not that they don't think about casual players, is that they underestimate the amount of casual players that will consume their content. I think that there's actually a majority of my audience that is more on the casual side than on the theory crafting side. They watch me because I get into their recommended, and that's it. Some of them are like, they find what I talk about interesting, but they wouldn't want to theory craft themselves. And I think that even though it is, at the end of the day, Lamau skill issue, just get good forehead, I still think that it's important to mention when a unit is going to be overperforming for casual players. But mostly theory crafting audiences, players that are focused on meta but don't theory craft themselves, very often hear things like that and say, why are you telling me this? I don't care. And that ends up giving theory crafters a bad name because they have to cater to their audience, but their audience doesn't want to know about the suboptimal things. They don't want to know about the casual things. And theory crafters do talk about it. They do think about it. It's just people don't ask them about it, or not as often. I kind of just wanted to have that little like aside for this because I think it's important. But anyways, getting back to the subject at hand, Cyno is going to be a unit that somewhat overperforms for casual players. So as a general rule, right, units that are weak, generally I'm like, yeah, you can pull for them if you really want them, but generally I wouldn't recommend them. I don't know if that's necessarily the case for Cyno. Like, obviously, like, if you don't like him, don't go for him. But there are very often people that like a lot of characters and have to choose between those characters. And if that's you, Cyno is a pretty okay option to go for if you don't want to be bothered learning about rotations and stuff like that. When it comes to optimally played teams, though, what I've looked at hasn't been too great. Not bad, but somewhat underwhelming. Now, I've talked on stream, I've looked at Cyno's damage and I talked about how it compares to Keqing, and I think that's a very important point. When I did that initially, I ended up underestimating his animation speed because we didn't have any footage back then. Now that we have some footage, looking at the actual damage difference, Cyno does do more damage than Keqing, but he has a very significant downside in exchange for that, which is that once you swap out, you don't have his burst anymore. Whereas in Keqing's case, you can swap out as much as you want. And that's very relevant because most of the good buffs in this game don't last 18 seconds. You look at Kazuha's buff, you look at Viridescent Venerer, you look at Bennett buff, there's just so many buffs that just don't last that long. And on top of that, skill cooldowns are very often not that long either. And so what's going to end up happening is your buffs are generally going to run out about 10 seconds in, but you don't want to swap out of him because if you do, then you'll lose almost half of his damage. But then on top of that, you don't get to swap back to your supports to generate energy for them. And so you can always just decide to swap out early, swap out after 10 seconds instead of like 18, swap out after 1 Enseer instead of 3. But why? If you're going to end up doing that, then you kind of just end up with nothing to do for the rest of your rotation. Make sure you just swap out, you go refresh your buffs, and then what? You refresh your buffs, but you can't even swap back to him. You can, but you're not going to do any damage because his burst is on cooldown. Basically, right, what I'm getting at is most of our roster doesn't have great synergy with carries that have very long field time. Our roster generally has more synergy with carries that have short field time. And generally, the characters that have synergy with longer field time don't fit that well in Cyno teams. You look at Xingqiu, he he is going to be a unit that you can slot in, but he's going to mean you can't really aggravate, which is pretty much a massive downside. Now, the comparison to Keqing is very relevant because Keqing does slightly less damage, but in exchange has a lot of flexibility in her rotations, which means that her teams are going to be doing more damage because her teams, you can swap back into them. You can use their burst more often. Right, you look at Kazuha, for example, you can pretty easily just come up with a 15-second Keqing rotation that uses Kazuha's burst every 15 seconds. And when you have Aggravate on Kazuha, Kazuha's swirls can aggravate and his Electro Infusion can also aggravate, and he basically builds full EM, so he actually gets a pretty significant amount of damage if you're in AoE situations. In single target, not quite as much, but in AoE, he actually does get a lot. And when you play Cyno, you get that burst every 22-25 seconds instead of every 15 seconds, which is a pretty massive DPS loss on your other units. All of this to say, the reason why I compared him to Keqing and I was relatively disappointed is because I felt like his damage wasn't far ahead enough to really justify his field time requirements. Now, I know that a lot of people are going to hear this and are going to think, wow, that means he's shit. But the reality is, 3.0 buffed Keqing a lot. Keqing is significantly better now than she was before. She is actually just pretty decent unit now. Her rotations line up really well with Fischl, that has 12-second duration on C6 on her Oz, whereas Keqing has 12-second cooldown on her burst. So you can kind of do pretty, nice rotations with that. She can swap out whenever, which means you can use Kazuha's E more often than a lot of other teams. You have a lot of things going for you with Keqing in Quicken teams. And so she is actually pretty good now. And when I say, I don't think that the difference in damage between him and Keqing is high enough to justify how much more restrictive his field time is, keep in mind that Keqing is actually a pretty decent unit now. Also, in order to get good damage out of Keqing, you need to do your rotations right. And like I said with Cyno, that doesn't matter as much. Because with Cyno, you're on him for 18 seconds. What the hell can you fuck up? And so, I don't want people to have the takeaway from this video being yeah, Cyno's worse than Keqing, don't go for him. I would argue that they're more or less similar in strength overall, with different strengths and different weaknesses, but also Keqing is a lot better now than she was before. So that doesn't mean he's bad. Anyways, all of that being said, let's actually get into the teams themselves. So what teams are you going to end up playing him in? Well, there's obviously going to be Aggravate / Quicken teams. And in Quicken teams, he's going to be good. They're going to be okay, but like I said, we just don't really have the right units that synergize with long field times like him. Beidou actually works very well with long field time, but then what? I mean, you can go for a Dendro main character and you're gonna have good quicken uptime, but Dendro main character does not do a lot of damage. So it's oh, okay. If you were able to have a Dendro Xingqiu instead, now that would be pretty good. Then what's your last slot? Well, you don't have a defensive option yet, and it's a character that needs to stay on the field for very long, so you kind of have an incentive to go for something like Zhongli, who also doesn't do damage themselves. Sure, they can buff your damage a little bit, but not by much. The other general options are going to be an electro healer like Yuki or Dori, which is going to be okay. You're getting aggravates, it's fine. Or you can go for an animal unit, either an animal healer like Jin or Sayu, or just an offensive animal unit like Kazuha. And Kazuha's uptime on his buffs isn't going to be that good, but Kazuha's personal damage in AoE is actually quite nice, which means that it's still going to be okay. Overall, his Quicken teams are going to be fine. They could get better once we get Dendro units that are actually significant damage themselves, or that are healers so that you can get away with using a unit like Kazuha more easily. As a general rule, I would say, yeah, he's basically meant to be a Quicken unit, but just don't expect him to break the game there. So what else do we have? We have Hyperbloom teams. And if you've watched my Dendro reaction guide video, you'll know that there's basically two ways that you can go about Hyperbloom. You can either go fast Hydro application and just generate a lot of seeds, or you can go slow Hydro application so that you don't really lose too much Quicken uptime, because Hydro can actually remove Quicken. Generally, two sources of Hydro are going to remove Quicken. So let's separate those two. We'll have the Quicken and Hyperbloom, so the Quickbloom teams, and we'll have the normal Hyperbloom teams. So for Quickbloom, there's actually a thing that is very relevant here, which is that when you use the general slow Hydro units like Kokomi, you still have Hydro application that is slightly faster than your Dendro main character, which actually means that you still do lose some aggravates. Not too many, but you do lose some. Now on top of that, Kokomi will generate 7 seeds. The thing is, there's another unit that can generate 7 seeds, but that applies Hydro once every 3 seconds instead of once every 2 seconds. seconds, and so they won't actually reduce your quicken up time. And that unit is Barbara. Barbara's slower hydro that actually lasts longer actually has an upside in Cyno teams, because you need to stay on Cyno, so you can't really go back to Kokomi to refresh her burst. So you're kind of capped out at 7 per rotation, 7 blooms. Maybe 8 if you weave in a normal attack before you swap, but generally around 7. And with Barbara, you also get 7. It's on a longer cooldown, and it applies it slower, but that doesn't matter as much if you're going to be staying on Cyno for a long time. Now, Barbara's cooldown is 27 seconds, which is generally slightly longer than what you want your rotations to be. You can either just, if you're more of a casual player, just do 27-second rotations, and it's fine. Or you can put sacrificial fragments on Barbara, because when she casts E, she deals damage to enemies twice, so you can actually get a proc. Or you can put her on Thundering Fury and get 1 or 2 proc and drive your rotation length down to 25 instead of 27. Generally though, I just say stick to the normal stuff on Barbara and just go for 27-second rotations and stay on Cyno for a little bit longer. You can also go for Ayato instead. Ayato has a passive that when he's not on field, he generates energy if he's under half. Generally, you don't use it, but you can actually make use of it in a team like this, where you start with your Ayato burst and you don't even use his E. And you just swap out, and at the end of your rotation, you go back to Ayato. You use his E until your burst is back, and then you stay on him. You'll need to get a lot of energy recharge, somewhere around 250-ish% range. So he's not going to be doing much damage, but he can have off-field hydro application, and it does last 18 seconds, which is nice for Cyno. It does, however, have a pretty significant downside that, depending on how exactly the RNG ends up happening, sometimes you'll hit the enemies too quickly in a row, and it's going to remove Quicken like Kokomi can. But it is a thing that you can do. Next up, let's look at the actual Hyperbloom teams, where you don't try to keep Quicken uptime, and you just go like triple EM on Cyno, and you just have a Hydro unit and Dendro units and just trigger as many Hyperblooms as you can. I think those teams are going to be pretty good, but they basically have the same issue as the Quicken teams, which is that you don't want to be staying on your Hyperbloom trigger for 18 seconds because your stuff's going to expire. And so when it comes to just pure Hyperbloom teams, they're going to be very viable, for sure. But I don't really see the point of playing Cyno over other choices there. It's good. If you like Cyno, you want to play him, it's one of the teams you can do. But if you want to play Hyperbloom and you're considering, well, should I pull for Cyno to make my Hyperbloom team better? If it's like a pure Hyperbloom team, I'm not expecting it to be that much better. So let's actually just put the verdict here, right? So Quicken, good. Quickbloom, good. Hyperbloom, okay. Now, what other options do you have other than that? When it comes to like what Cyno's kit is really designed to do, that's kind of it. You can try to run him as a hyper carry without Hyperbloom, but it's just not gonna be better. So the main like things that you have left are basically overweight teams where you just run him in national. And they're gonna be good, but not synergistic, where teams are good, but just why go for Cyno if you're gonna be putting him in a fucking national team? Taser, same thing. Overload. Oof. I don't expect Overload teams to be any good. Keep in mind that in order to get value out of an Electro unit triggering Overload, you have to keep a Pyro Aura, which can actually be pretty difficult to do. It is doable, right? You can go for like Bennett, Dendro MC, Xiangling, Cyno. Or Bennett, Jean, Xiangling, Cyno. And it should be doable. It's just not worth it because other units could do the same thing but better. That Cyno is going to be doing in that team. And then on top of that, you get the issues with Overload that like it knocks enemies away. He's basically going to be playable in any of the teams where you play Raiden, just as a downgrade. But if you want to play him there, go ahead. Hi YouTube, this is Following Days of Jeff. Just wanting to add a few precisions and corrections. I think that there's a bit more value to Hyperbloom teams than I initially gave him credit for. I actually like mathed out what his damage should look like in Hyperbloom teams, and even in Hyperbloom teams, he does seem to have like a bit of an advantage in terms of personal damage because from his like normal numbers, even if he's not building for them specifically. So basically, I think that the Hyperbloom teams are going to be actually better than okay. They're also going to be good. I've looked at a few Quicken teams, and you basically do have the like issue of not synergizing with a lot of the supports, like I talked about already. But some of the units just do so much damage by themselves that you still want to play them if you can get away without a healer. And that's kind of where all of this ends up like lining up, is the Quicken, the Quickbloom, and the Hyperbloom team. So they're all gonna be like somewhat similar. When you go for no defensive options and only offensive options, like Kazuha, whatever, like Beto, your team is going to do more damage, but you're trading survivability for it. And because he doesn't have the greatest synergy with the good healers we have, your best survivability options is either basically going to be Barbara or Zhongli, where Zhongli's more versatile and will generally be slightly higher team DPS, but Barbara's actually not that far behind because of the Hyperblooms you're gaining in Quickbloom teams. But yeah, all this to say, there's more value to Hyperbloom teams than I give it credit for, which means that PM Circlet might actually be a bit better than I give it credit for. And in Hyperbloom teams, you can actually make an argument for 4-piece Gilded Dreams being better than Thundering Fury, if you can get enough energy recharge. Now the biggest issue is that in pure Hyperbloom teams, so something like Cyno, Dendro main character, Xingqiu, Yelan, Kokomi, the issue that you'll run into there is you don't have that much energy generation, which means that Thundering Fury's energy generation is actually really, really valuable. But if you can get away with relatively low ER, if you play double Electro in Hyperbloom with something like Beto, then the 4-piece Gilded Dream can actually be a pretty okay alternative. Also, it seems like his best weapon in Hyperbloom teams. I said that Dragon's Bane was situationally going to be good, but after actually mathing it out, Keqing is actually basically always better. And so Keqing gives you energy generation, which means that you can more easily get away without the Thundering Fury set. Anyways, Hyperbloom teams are a little bit better. In Hyperbloom teams, PM Circlet is viable. 4-piece Gilded, it can, in some situations, be better than TF. And Keqing Cross Spear is a better option than usual. It will be better than White Tassel in those teams. Alright, so this is following like week or second week, I don't know, the Jeff. And I basically just wanted to add a thing on Overload because there's a mechanic that I haven't really talked about much that you can use in Electro and Dendro teams to get a lot more overloads than you would otherwise be able to. Now, I don't think it's a mechanic that'll be very useful on Cyno's release, but I do think it has some potential with future Pyro units and or future Dendro units. So I just wanted to cover it. So I do it like this, and this, and this, and this. As you can see here, we're getting our Quicken, and once we've gotten our Quicken, if we have Quicken with an underlying Electro aura, like we have here because Razor applies a lot of Electro, when we apply Pyro onto it, it's going to trigger Overloaded and Burning. But then the Burning aura can be used to trigger Overloaded with your Electro character, not just one time, right? So we got Bennett's Overload that's doing 283, Razor's first Overload that's doing 1437, and Razor's second Overload that's doing 1558. So effectively, we get 2 overloads on Razor, 2 aggravates on Razor, and 1 overload on your Pyro unit. Now, with the right off-field Pyro and off-field Dendro, it would be possible to consistently maintain a bunch of burning on the enemy, but burn away a Quicken aura instead of a Dendro aura so that you can still be triggering Aggravate. Because while enemies are burning, you can still trigger Aggravate if what's burning is a Quicken and not a Dendro. And so, as you should be able to do, is basically to have a team that focuses on burning, overloaded, and aggravate all at once. Now, in this case, because Razor's Electro application isn't the fastest, we're actually losing some Quicken, but with Cyno, you should be able to get a pretty decent amount of aggravates and of overload. But it can actually be pretty difficult to use those teams properly, because Cyno generally doesn't want to be solo Electro, because then his energy requirements become very, very high. And with a lot of the other Electro units, what's going to end up happening is you're going to trigger 2 overloads, but because Overloaded actually has a quote-unquote hidden mechanic where it has a global internal cooldown, where when you trigger 2 overloads within 0.15 seconds of each other, which is 8 frames or less, you actually just lose the damage. You'll still consume the gauge normally, but you'll actually just lose the damage. And so you can see it very easily just by using Bennett's E, because it applies 2 units. So if I use Bennett's E, and then Razor's normal attack with C6, there's still some Pyro left for a second overloaded. But if I go to an enemy that's very squishy, so you can actually see like how much damage they're taking, and then I remove all of my Elemental Mastery on Razor and put it on Beto instead. So I get my Beto Burst active, I apply Pyro to this dude, and then I do this. It's taking less than like a 1/5 of its health bar, whereas if I just do it like this, Well, it's taking a lot more. We're doing about a third of its health with an overloaded, but the first time we did it, we most definitely did trigger overloaded because like we said, right? When you apply 2 units of pyro and then use Razor's normal attack with Constellation 6, there's still gonna be some pyro left for another overloaded, and there was no pyro left, so we did consume our pyro, we did trigger overload, it just didn't deal damage. And so this mechanic can potentially just not work when you're using electro units that basically apply electro at the same time as Cyno does. However, and this is just so incredibly funny to me, there are certain mechanics in this game that are different or that function differently with a different amount of ping. And Beto is actually one of those mechanics. Beto's burst only triggers a discharge when the server registers that you've attacked the enemy, not when your computer registers that. And so basically, if you have high ping, your Beto burst procs a little bit later. I don't have Razor C6 on this account, so I can't show it the exact same way. So I'll use Lisa instead. I'll also do it with Lisa on my other account to show the difference. So I use Beto's burst. I use Bennett E, and then Lisa Auto. We actually do get 2 overloaded numbers. But if I go back to my main account, this time we only get 1 instance of overload damage. But yeah, so what actually ends up happening is this is a mechanic that you can take advantage of a little bit more if you're on high ping, which is just really fucking funny to me. If you're not on high ping, it's a thing that should be able to function relatively well with Keqing. It will not work at all with Fischl, even on high ping, because Fischl Ascension 4, what happens when you trigger an electro reaction, it triggers instantly, and none of it has to wait for the server to do anything, whereas with Beto ping can. This is probably the funniest shit, the funniest interaction that I've seen. I don't know, dude. It's hilarious. I can see something like Cyno, Beto, Toma, Dendro, whatever, being a team that people might enjoy. I don't think it'll be very good. It's still an overload team. And then on top of that, you're sharing the ownership of your overload between different characters, which means you can't just full stack one of those characters with EM and the other ones with talent damage. You're gonna have to kind of give EM to a lot of them. I'll have to do some testing on it when he comes out. I'm actually kind of excited for it. I think it's gonna be really funny. It's so funny to me that there's gonna be a team that just works a lot better when you have high ping. I mean, you can't not find that. Like, that is funny. That is just fucking hilarious, right? Like, I can't be the only one. Anyways, back to normals legit. The verdict on how good the teams are for these 3 is actually heavily reliant on what Dendro units we have available to us. In other words, this shit could change a lot over the course of the patches 3.x, right? 3.2, it's been leaked that we're gonna get Nahida. I mean, we might get some Dendro 4 stars, and then we might get Al-Hytham towards the end of 3. Whatever. Point being, these are not set in stone, so it's possible that they end up becoming better once we get more synergistic Dendro units. Just do keep in mind that it's not fucking worth pulling for a unit because you expect them to get better later on. Because they're gonna get rerun. Units get rerun in Genshin. If you only want Cyno because you think he's gonna be good with a future unit, just wait for that future unit, get that future unit, and then get Cyno on his rerun. Because they could also just release units that don't work with Cyno. But yeah, I think that's it for the Cyno pre-release. As a closing statement, closing thoughts on Cyno, I'm very excited for him. His gameplay looks like it's gonna be very fun for me, and I've been preaching about Thundering Fury for so long. We finally have a new character release that is actually meant to be played with Thundering Fury, so there's no way I'm not going for him. I don't expect him to be particularly strong. He's gonna be pretty okay. Nothing crazy, but nothing terrible either. I wouldn't recommend expecting him to be all that strong on your guys' end either, because I don't want you to pull for him and be disappointed. But as usual, I'll cover him on release. I'll publish a post-release video before the banner is over, so if you still have doubts, feel free to wait for that. Dude, I'm hyped. He looks so fun. Anyways, I guess that does it. Bye, YouTube. Did he just